Up until now, we've talked about the lower organisms. They were all single-celled creatures, uh, potentially multi-celled slime molds or fungi, but on the whole, single cells. However, being multicellular comes with advantages. The larger size of the cell means that they can house more genetic information. It also means that they don't have to wait entirely for osmosis and diffusion, that there can be organelles that create products de novo. By being bigger, they're less likely to get eaten. This increases survival. By being able to sustain itself without too much outside input, these cells tend to have a longer life, mechanisms for repair. There's often many organelles with redundancy, which ensures life beyond a single cell's lifespan. By being multi-celled, you could lose several cells and know that other cells in that tissue could pick up the slack. And it also means that the cells could begin to specialize. Different cells could do unique tasks, and this would increase their efficiency, since not all cells had to focus on a single task, but could then delegate roles across the organism. I want to remind you about the hierarchy of organization. The smallest possible unit of life is a cell, but many cells can be strung together to create a tissue. Multiple tissues can come together to form an organ. Multiple organs with similar or complementary tasks can form an organ system, and multiple systems with distinct tasks give rise to an organism. There are a lot of things that have to happen for the plant to grow and grow well. Plants have evolved very specific responses to their environmental cues to increase their chances of survival. At its core, any signal pathway is going to involve some sort of stimulus, a signal. This might be light, sound, temperature, a secreted hormone. It also needs a receptor, something to observe that signal, to receive that message, and pass it on. And at the end, some sort of response, an observable change. Often, this is communicated by the nucleus and the expression of particular genes. During the signal transduction process, where it's being passed between receptors on the way to the nucleus, three changes can occur. Know the difference between translation, amplification, and bifurcation. Translation is depicted here in the brown to green to blue. In this case, the signal is being modified in some way, shape, or form. The blue, single arrow going in to 4 arrows coming out, is an example of amplification. Sometimes that signal is copied and released on high. The last change depicted here is bifurcation. Sometimes a signal can be split in two. One destined for the nucleus of this particular cell, the second destined for the neighboring cell. Bifurcation is essential for concerted efforts between cells of the tissue. Now, I do want to point out that no signal transduction has to have translation, amplification, and bifurcation, and they don't have to occur in any particular order. But these are three types of changes that might occur in response to that message being passed. Ultimately, these signals will go to the nucleus and activate particular genes or turn particular genes off, and in doing so, that expression will modify the plant's response. So what are some of these plants' responses? We refer to them as tropisms. It's a tendency of some sort. Positive tropisms are a tendency toward that thing. A negative tropism is a tendency to avoid that thing. Plants exhibit a positive gravitotropism. This means that they can sense the weight of gravity and they grow against it. So, as you can see in the first panel here, even though the plant has been kicked over, the shoots are still orienting in the direction of the sky. Plants also exhibit a positive phototropism. They lean towards the sun. They follow the sun. They do this to maximize their photosynthetic potential during our 12 hours or so of daylight time. The sunflower gets its name partly because of how it looks, but also because it tracks the sun for the entire length of the day, turning the head of the flower to continue to stare at the sun all day. It does this not for photosynthesis, although that is a secondary benefit, but it's because the internal structure of the flower, where all the seeds are stored, is a very, very dark brown. And when that faces the sun, it gets really hot. Dark colors retain heat. This has evolved as a pest resistance measure. By having an internal core that's hot, this reduces the likelihood of pests, bugs, and insects landing and growing and destroying the seedlings. The last panel here is thigmotropism, and this is a gathering response to touch. When plants are touched, these are the vines, they exhibit a positive thigmotropism, and as long as they're touching something, they will continue to grow towards that thing touching them and therefore coil around a fence post or a tree trunk. Turgor movements are either open or closed, and this involves a massive rush of water to create a very flat structure when it's lacking water, or a very full structure when it is turgid. Plants use hormones much like we do for long distance communication. They help coordinate growth, development, and responses to stimuli. Hormones are very effective in low concentrations and can have profound effects across the entire organism. Even though plants often use the same types of hormones, the specific responses are going to depend upon where that hormone is secreted, where it is received, and the developing stage of the plant, as well as the amount of hormone issued. Know the 5 major hormones and what they do. Auxin encourages new growth. As long as auxin is being secreted, the plant will continue to grow up. Cytokinin is a whole group of hormones, and they prolong shelf life. They slow down aging. Gibberellins are a hormone that say reproduce, and so they help fruit set. Abscisic acid is a hormone that's secreted that tells the plant to sleep now, to slow down, to not photosynthesize, to maintain a sense of almost hibernation and wait out a period of less than ideal environments. Ethylene is a unique one. This is the only hormone that is not water soluble. This is a gaseous hormone. And ethylene is responsible for the color change in deciduous plants come autumn. That color change is known as abscission. The fact that ethylene is a gas explains why one tree might be getting color change leaves in October, and then the next day the entire block is ablaze with color. That gas travels and becomes a domino effect for other trees nearby. It also leads to us having some life hacks. You can use a ripe tomato to drive the ripening of an avocado or a banana by putting one ripe fruit into a small brown paper bag or a Tupperware container with your unripened fruit, and the ethylene gas, it takes time, over the span of several hours, will coax the other into ripening. We already know that roots are for anchorage and absorption. Within the roots, there are 3 different zones, the zones of differentiation, elongation, and division. It's important to point out that due to apical dominance, the zone of cell division is at the very, very end of the root. So as the root continues to dig further down, the cells there are rapidly dividing and becoming new and new and new. The cells behind it in the zone of elongation are going to lengthen as they begin to specialize, as genes are turned on and off to allow them to fulfill their roles as absorbers or supplemental cells. And then behind that, the older cells still, we have our zone of differentiation in which they truly specialize, sprouting root hairs, feeding off the taproot structure or the fibrous nature, and fulfilling their role there. Beyond the zone of cell division is the root cap. The root cap is not truly cellular. It is completely gelatinous, and it is replaced often, so it does exhibit cell division and behavior, but it itself is not a complete cell. Its role is to be wholly protective. So as that root is digging further into the ground, it is essentially being sloughed off. The root cap is there to cushion and protect the actual cells that are dividing. So as mentioned, the apical meristem is the tip of the root and the tip of the shoot. So the tippy top and the tippy bottom of our tree. This is where primary growth is occurring. This is where cell division occurs. So as above, so below. The tree, the plant is growing up and down simultaneously in near equal balance. As we look at the types of root that exhibit, we've seen some of these terms before. Taproot versus fibrous, when we talked about monocots versus dicots. It has to do with where the originating line is. What we're introducing now is the concept of adventitious roots. These are roots that arise typically above ground. They arise somewhere else on the plant, not below the surface. And their role is to provide an advantage, make it possible to vegetatively propagate this plant from a stem or leaf cutting, or increase their water absorption in areas where there might be infrequent floods or large fog vapors. Sometimes these adventitious roots can completely reach down to the ground and penetrate the soil. As we build upon our understanding of the above ground counterparts, the shoots, I would like to point out that there are essentially 4 types. Stolons and rhizomes are used to describe runners. Stolons are above ground runners, in which case the stem leans, and where it touches and breaks the 180-degree horizon and reaches the soil, it will start to sprout roots and anchor itself there. A good example of something with stolons is strawberries. Rhizomes are similar, however, these runners grow below the ground. And so in this case, the root structure, the rhizome, is growing horizontally below the ground surface, and where it does breach and come into contact with oxygen, this triggers new gene expression, which will create stem growth above. A good example of this is ginger. The last 2 are tubers and corms. These are specialized shoots. They are not meant to help spread necessarily. Their primary focus is resource acquisition. Tubers are underground food storage units, so they are typically full of starch and stored carbs. A good example of this is potatoes or taro. Corms do have reproductive capacity, but in large part, they're meant to be underground water storage units. So a good example of this is an onion or a narcissa bulb. Above ground, we classify shoots as herbaceous or woody, depending upon what type of growth they exhibit. For plants, the primary focus is to grow up and towards the sun to increase photosynthetic capacity. If you are successful in this manner, then some plants evolve to have a secondary priority, the ability to grow out, to stabilize, to provide strength and security and infrastructure. So herbaceous plants are those that can only grow up, meaning their entire stem, while lignanized and strong, and while vascular, has a set capacity of height. It cannot grow too much beyond that because it doesn't have additional support mechanisms. The entire stem is one width unilaterally through the whole thing. Woody plants exhibit primary and secondary growth, which means they first grow up and then successively they will start to grow out, strengthening and supporting the plant. Woody trees will grow much higher than any herbaceous counterpart. Within the ground tissue of the shoots, we see 3 smaller types of cells. They're the parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. Be aware of their different focuses and priorities. The parenchyma cells are our great dividers. These cells reproduce and are responsible for that lateral growth, the annual tree rings that occur. The collenchyma cells secrete collagen, and so they are there to provide flexible support. So that way, when there's wind and rain and elemental changes, the tree has some give and flexibility so it doesn't just break. Meanwhile, the sclerenchyma perform a different function. They secrete lignin, which is a complex polymer that is impermeable to water and creates the most mechanical strength on the planet. It makes the tree tough and hard. So while the tree branches are going to exhibit some collagen and flexibility, the sclerenchyma cells and the lignin that they secrete are there to ensure that the outermost cells are super tough and hard to protect the tree. Within our ground tissue, we also see these vascular bundles. So a reminder, the xylem moves water up through the roots to the tippy tops of the leaves, whereas the phloem takes the sugars generated in the leaves through photosynthesis and transmit them down through the plant. We use the term vascular tissue because sugar and water are the plant's life's fluid, just like blood is to the human host. When a plant is full of water, we use the word turgid, and if a plant is water deficient, we use the word wilted to describe that water loss. Plants are only able to stay upright when they have a turgid cell, unless they have that lignin structure to support it. So it's really important that plants be able to move water from an area of high abundance, the ground, to where it's least abundant, the leaves. And so there are a number of mechanisms here that help drive water from the roots to the shoots. The goal is bring in new fresh water for a number of reasons. One, fresh water brings with it additional resources like dissolved nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but also, two, because stagnant water is a breeding ground for bacteria. And so we don't want that colonizing the inside of the plant. We want to create a drive. And so transpiration is a process by which water is constantly being pulled via osmosis through the roots, through the stem, through the leaves, and out through the tips of the leaves. It's basically evaporation through plant tissue. And transpiration occurs because the plant's tissue is studded with stomata. These are specialized pores that open and close to allow gas exchange, but also to allow for the movement of water. The stomata is regulated by guard cells. Understand their role, the significance of their position. When there's lots of water, the guard cells swell with water, and this creates a bowing effect, which opens the stomata. But as water begins to evaporate out this open pore, water becomes less frequent in the plant. And just like a tire, when flattened, collapses in on itself, if too much water is lost through transpiration, the guard cells will empty and the stomata will close, ensuring that not all water leaves the plant. This creates just enough of a deficit so that the plant can osmosis new water in and the cycle can continue. Water movement is also helped by root pressure. There is a force exerted by gravity and the ground pushing on the roots. What this does is it puts pressure on the roots to uptake more water and drive the water movement up through the plant. Think of it kind of like squeezing the base of a straw, and you would see the water level in that straw pushing higher a bit more. Another mechanism that plants have to help ensure that there's going to be a constant flow of water is a process known as guttation. If too much water is taken into the plant, we don't want the plant to burst, and so excess water is leaked out the very tips of the leaves. This is not the same as dew, which is condensation. Guttation is water from within the plant being pushed out. But again, this creates a small deficit, which leads to more water being taken up again. The final mechanism that we have to help ensure water continues throughout the whole plant is the nature of hydrogen bonds. Cohesion is the attraction of like-minded things. Cohesive means of the same mind, of the same substance. And so cohesion refers to water bonds between water molecules, hydrogen bonds between water molecules. And so what happens is as water is moving up the tree's column, the water will pull water molecules behind it and pull water molecules behind it, creating a train, an uninterrupted chain of water throughout the whole tree. So cohesion ensures water climbs up the plant as things evaporate or are guttated out. Meanwhile, adhesion is the attraction of different molecules. A good way to remember this is to think you're adding something new to the mix. Adhesion ensures that when the stomata closes and there's no longer a pull, that the water molecules can bind to the inside of the stem to prevent any slippage or falling back down. An interesting thing to note about plants is that leaf size is generally correlated to the available water. In areas where water is abundant, where there's regular rainfall, plants can afford to have very large leaves to maximize their photosynthetic potential because they are not at any shortage of water to support that chemical process. Meanwhile, in areas like deserts, where water is few and far between, rainy periods are short-lived, trees will exhibit very small, narrow leaves because this will decrease the surface area and therefore decrease their water loss potential. So one can typically look at a plant and know where it evolved, where it's native to, based upon the size and shape of its leaf. Speaking of shapes, leaves come in basically three forms: simple, compound, or double compound. The idea here is an organization to maximize photosynthetic potential so that the leaves in the upper canopy are not shading out and blocking out the utility of the leaves in the lower canopy. Simple leaves mean that there's a single leaf per stalk. A compound leaf has leaflets on a stalk, so it looks like a leaf of leaves. And a double compound leaf has a stalk of stalks with many leaflets. So it has to do with degrees of freedom. How do you know where a leaf begins and a branch ends? Well, what you need to look for is the axillary bud. Be able to recognize alternating growths where branching patterns go left, then right, then left, then right. Opposite patterns, both simultaneously at the 180 and 0 degrees, and then completely rotating 90 degrees to be a 270 and 90, or whorled, growing in a complete circle in regular intervals. This creates pockets of space on the tree, on its branch, to ensure that there's going to be areas where light can filter in so that there's not overcrowding. The leaf area index is a calculation that basically determines the ratio of leaves per plant. It's simply calculated as the area covered by leaves, total surface area exposed, divided by the ground below. And the idea here is plants want to have leaves because it enables them to make more photosynthesis, which enables them to have more ATP and energy to grow bigger, grow fruit, reproduce. But too many leaves and you start shading out your own branches. And so what we find is that in nature, we most consistently see a leaf area index of 7. That's the in general average, the ideal. For a plant to be successful, there's a lot that needs to be coordinated on a daily basis. And so we want to talk about rhythms and cues. There are many different rhythms that exist in nature. Some rhythms occur once in a lifetime. Other rhythms are seasonal. Some rhythms, like the circadian rhythm, occurs on a daily basis. For something to be described as a circadian rhythm, 3 criteria must be met. 1, it has to occur once every 24 hours. 2, it has to be entrainable. This means that it will occur without you teaching it. It's a natural response. And the third is that there must be some sort of temperature compensation. And so should the rhythm run a little later or slower or at different seasons of the time, there is some compensation happening within the body to accommodate that change. And so a good example of a circadian rhythm is hunger. We must eat on a daily basis. It is a free running period. You don't need to look at your clock to know, I'm hungry. It's probably lunchtime. And if we push that time frame forward or back, up or down, then there is some sort of compensation that's happening in our bodies. Another example of a circadian rhythm is sleep. Our sleepiness cues are determined due to gene expression of the timeless and period genes. Our eyes sense light from the sun, and this creates a stimulus that starts to begin the expression of timeless and period proteins. When these proteins reach a certain threshold, we begin to get sleepy. And so what we can see is in the diagram here, in the morning when the sun rises, light reaches the rods and cones of our eyes. It doesn't even matter if your eyes are open, they can sense this light. And this stimulus sends a message to the brain and to our cells to start secreting timeless and period. These proteins stimulate wakefulness. There's a reason why you wake up when the sun's out, why we have trouble sleeping when the sun's out, because our body is expressing wakeful proteins. And so the concentration of timeless and period will continue to build throughout the day until they're at an all-time high right around when sunset occurs, which is why we still have a decent amount of energy around dinner time. But once it's dark, we are no longer secreting wakeful proteins. Instead, we are utilizing those proteins. Those proteins are starting to break down. Their job is done for the day. And so as time progresses beyond sunset, we start to get a little bit more tired, a little bit more sluggish, a little bit more sleepy. And that concentration of timeless and period will continue to drop while we sleep until they're stimulated the next day when the sun rises again. So we can track time. Similar to this, plants use a particular receptor called the phytochrome to trigger their circadian rhythms. They don't need to know when to wake up, when to sleep, but they use photoperiodism, the ability to track time, to recognize seasons and to determine when they're going to flower. So as a result, we've come to determine that there are 3 photoperiodic patterns exhibited by plants. Short day plants only flower when the day length is shorter than a critical length threshold. So these are going to be your winter plants when daylight is shorter than 12 hours. Long day plants only flower when the day length is longer than that period. These are going to be your summer plants traditionally. And then there are day neutral plants who flower based upon some other cue, anything other than light. The point I want to make is that each plant has their very own threshold. Right? Some plants might have a 12-hour threshold or a 10-hour threshold or a 6-hour threshold. The concentration of light varies by species. When that threshold is met, a response is stimulated. And it's important to point out that the concentration is additive. It does not have to be one interrupted light cycle. So the example that I have on the far right is a short day plant. In this case, we see that the dotted line is that critical length. And in panel 1, the red is below that dotted line. And so it's a short day, shorter than normal, and we see the iris blooms. In the center panel, the red line crosses that dotted line threshold. So we had a longer day than typical, and in which case we do not flower. And in the third scenario on the far right, we see 2 separate light periods have occurred. But if we were to push them together and add them up, it would still be below this dotted line. And so the short day threshold is reached and we flower again. Meanwhile, looking at a long day scenario, in the first panel, we only see the flowering in panels 1 and 3 when the combined effects of that light cross the dotted line. And in this case, in the center panel, where it's below the dotted line, we did not light. The overall significance is that photoperiodism is responsible for the distribution of plants worldwide. It explains why spinach occurs in the tropics, because they need a long, long day period. Meanwhile, it doesn't occur in the upper elevations of Maine because they just don't get enough daylight to sprout growth there. It explains why we see poinsettias in the winter when day periods are shorter. Why we see chrysanthemums in the fall when day periods are a little bit longer. Why roses bloom in the summer. It has to do with those critical lengths. And we have been able to modify this by using grow lights or importing plants from other parts of the world. But it's understanding these patterns that will really determine whether or not that plant will continue to thrive and be successful in an environment where it may not be getting its critical needs met.